The door opened with a slow, creaky lament to reveal a woman with the fresh tracks of tears on her face. Her fingers, pale and trembling, held onto her housecoat as if it was a lifeline, pulling it closer as she took a moment to measure me up from head to toe. "Are you Mrs. Caldwell?" I offered gently. "I'm Agent Foster. I'm afraid I must disturb your peace for a few moments." She studied me through the misty reflection of her tears, and I could feel the weight of her stare, so cold, so hard. "They told me someone like you might come knocking," she whispered, her voice quivering. "You're the one from that elite FBI unit, aren't you?" I nodded, flashing my ID badge with practiced ease. She took her time scrutinizing it, her breath visible in the chill of the early evening. Giving a reluctant nod, she reluctantly let me in, her eyes darting around her quiet neighborhood as if hoping someone, anyone, would notice. I followed her up the aged wooden steps, their groans echoing my own dread. Inside, the home told a tale of memories, old, cherished furniture that had seen decades of use, walls adorned with photos of smiling faces at summer barbecues, wedding dances, and surprise birthday parties. It painted a picture of a life lived in love and warmth, a stark contrast to the chilling mystery that now clouded it. I scribbled a quick, vague note, hoping to retain the sentiment. Taking a deep breath, I broached the topic. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm here concerning your son, Peter. Could we possibly sit and discuss this further?" I moved to sit on an old, plush couch that seemed to have borne countless confidences over the years. She hesitated. "Would you like something to drink, Agent?" "Foster," I supplied. "And no, I appreciate the offer, but I'm fine." Instead of joining me in the comforting embrace of the furniture, she stood firm, a statue of grief and resilience. The weight of her stare made the back of my neck prickle. Clearing my throat, I ventured, "Mrs. Caldwell, about that night Peter disappeared. The doors, they were all bolted shut the next morning, correct?" She just nodded, her eyes distant. "What's confusing is that none of the keys were missing, and Peter didn't possess one. Can you shed some light on that?" She took a deep, shuddering breath, arms folded tightly. "Where exactly are you heading with this, Agent Foster?" The conversation wasn't unfolding as I'd envisioned. The neat theories I'd pieced together seemed to crumble. I hesitated, the cold pressure of her gaze urging me to reconsider every word. "Mrs. Caldwell, the circumstances of Peter's disappearance are uncanny. We need to ascertain if there's a missing detail, perhaps an unlocked window or maybe a trusted neighbor with access to your house." Her face grew harder, like a mask of carved stone. "You echo the words of the last detective. I'm certain, no open windows, no spare keys, no neglected doors." Her voice wavered with a mix of defiance and despair. I pressed on. "Kids can be unpredictable. Maybe he left after dinner, tempted by some childhood adventure in the woods. Can you be absolutely certain he was in his room that night?" She shot me a steely look, her voice icy. "I put him to bed, kissed him goodnight. I'm neither a neglectful mother nor someone lost to vice, Agent Foster. I know my son was home." "I am no forgetful mother," she whispered, her voice edged with a fierce intensity. "My memories of that night are vivid, like fresh wounds. Every door locked, every window sealed. My son safe and sound beneath his blanket." The room's energy grew heavy. Silence settled, filled only with the unspoken words and palpable grief. I pocketed my notepad, trying to decide on my next move, feeling the air thicken with each passing second. "Mrs. Caldwell," I ventured tentatively, "may I see Peter's room? Perhaps there's something there that we've missed." She seemed unmoved by my request, but a small nod directed me deeper into the heart of the house. The hallway, lined with ancient wooden floorboards, whispered memories under our feet. "Agent Foster," she inquired with a certain vulnerability, "do you have any children?" A small nod from me. "A son." "And how old might he be?" 11, I replied, my heart suddenly heavy, just like Peter. She paused, gathering herself before delivering her next words. "Now imagine, for just a fleeting moment, the crippling horror of finding his room empty. A child vanished without a trace, all while under your watch." The chilling words hung in the air between us, growing in weight. "It's an unthinkable torment," I murmured, thinking of my own son safe at home. We reached a pale blue door, and she hesitated for just a moment before opening it to reveal Peter's sanctuary. The room, painted in soft hues of blue, felt like a time capsule. Everything was untouched: a neatly made bed, a desk bearing a computer, and a gaming console with its beanbag chair thrown. It was remarkably tidy, more so than any room belonging to a young boy that I had ever seen. Were any of his personal items missing? Perhaps something to suggest he'd run off? I asked, scanning the room. Her voice quivered. He had no phone. He'd often asked, but I always said he wasn't ready. A sob caught in her throat. If only he had one. Perhaps we could have tracked him. I reached out, placing a comforting hand on her back. Even if he had, it's unlikely he'd have had it with him in bed. You mustn't torment yourself with the what-ifs. For a brief moment, our worlds, though different, aligned in shared parental concern. "You're not alone in your decisions, Mrs. Caldwell. My son doesn't have a phone either. I've told him the same." She looked like she was trying to hold the universe's pain in her eyes, her gaze flickering to the ceiling, as if willing the tears to evaporate. My eyes trailed to the slightly ajar closet door. I felt an odd pull, an unsettling allure towards that shadowed space. Why was it slightly open? My feet seemed to move of their own accord towards it. As I neared, she whispered, a tremor in her voice. Peter had confided something to me the night before he vanished. He believed there was a monster in that closet. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Surely, at 11, most kids have outgrown such fears. At least mine had. "He hadn't mentioned monsters for years," she continued, her voice laced with raw fear. "But that particular night, he was terrified. He even—" She hesitated. "He had an accident. Something he hadn't done in years." I turned to her, questions flooding my mind. "After he told you this, what ensued?" Mrs. Caldwell took a deep breath, eyes cast down as she remembered the events of that fateful night. After the incident, I held his trembling hand and led him back to his room. Determined to dispel his fears, I flicked on the light and swung open the closet door, revealing nothing more menacing than old garments and worn-out shoes. However, his fear remained undeterred. He was convinced that the monster had a knack for camouflaging, becoming one with the shadows. As her words danced in my head, I found myself compelled to approach the slightly ajar closet door again. Each step felt heavier, more tentative, as if wading through a thick morass. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He tried washing away his fears, and as a mother, I did what I could, changing his soiled sheets and tucking him in. He yearned to remain close to me, his sanctuary, eyes glued to the TV's flickering light. But I made the decision to send him back to his room. It was nearing 2 in the morning, after all, and school awaited him the next day." Her voice cracked, choked by the weight of regret and the tears that followed. With a deep breath, I finally pulled open the closet door. The darkness that met my gaze was not the benign sort one might expect in a child's wardrobe. It was deeper, consuming and unnervingly oppressive. It felt sentient, like an entity that chose to wear the facade of mere shadow. "Is it possible to make this room any brighter?" I asked, more to ground myself than to actually expect an improvement. She shook her head. "I've tried different bulbs, but the light just grows dimmer and dimmer. An electrician might need to have a look." Trying to penetrate this tangible blackness, I pulled out my flashlight. The light it emitted seemed unnaturally feeble against the overwhelming void of the closet, as if it were a flickering candle against a tempestuous wind. Was the battery failing, or was something inside repelling the light? From behind me, her voice trembled. "Can you sense it? That presence? The same thing that my boy talked about. The thing that watches, the thing that hides." Caught in the eerie gravity of the closet, I struggled to respond. Her voice grew more insistent. "Why won't you turn your back to it, Agent Foster? It's seen you, recognized you, and I have a sinking feeling that isn't to our advantage." Gathering my courage, I slammed the closet door shut. The clicking sound was like a lifeline, and I felt like I'd been released from some sinister trance. We both nearly sprinted out of the room, and I hastily excused myself to the restroom. Staring at my reflection, a stranger's gaze met mine, a worn-out face etched with exhaustion and dread. My skin was tinged with a sickly hue. As if on cue, an overwhelming wave of nausea hit, sending me to my knees. From deep within, a dark, viscous substance surged forth. Like ink from a ruptured pen, it splattered into the porcelain bowl. The bile felt like acid, burning its way up, and as it settled, it left an aftertaste that was at once metallic and rotten. Washing my face, I battled the dizziness and unease. The weight of what just occurred pressed down on me, but I was resolute in completing my mission. I had to continue the interview, even if the pit in my stomach told me to flee. Mrs. Caldwell awaited my return in the kitchen, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the room's lone bulb. As I entered, a surreal dizziness swept over me. I fought it, pressing both hands to my temples, trying to will the world to right itself. "I just have a few more questions," I forced out, shielding my mouth with my hand to prevent her from witnessing the grim evidence of my earlier ordeal. Every beat of my heart echoed loudly in my ears, a frenetic drum threatening to burst from my chest. Denial was my defense, refusing to admit that something sinister and deeply unnatural had infiltrated my being. Mrs. Caldwell's concerned gaze lingered on me. "You don't look well, Agent Foster. There's a sickly pallor to your skin. Are you certain you're all right?" With a forced steadiness, I redirected the conversation. "Let's focus on Peter's father. I believe he departed this world some years back. Did he leave behind family? Any close acquaintances?" But she brushed off my questions as inconsequential, and perhaps, in the grand scope of things, they were. By the time I exited her home, a blur of confusion enveloped me. The latter part of our discussion had been completely wiped from my memory, replaced by a disconcerting emptiness. It felt as if I had been merely a passenger in my own body, guided by an unseen driver. Deep down, I harbored the unsettling notion that Peter's mysterious disappearance would remain unsolved. If any truths did emerge, they'd be of such nature that they'd never see the light of day, buried deep within confidential files. Revealing my experiences to my higher-ups was out of the question. To them, it would sound like delirium. Besides, the cold trail of the case meant no one truly expected results. My history of unresolved cases provided me cover. I didn't owe anyone any explanations, but my clarity seemed to erode further with each passing moment. Local law enforcement regarded me with a mix of pity and disdain, implying through their expressions that I was grasping at straws. Returning home was a haze. The flight I boarded was a red-eye. Sleep eluded me, nightmares filling its place. The images were clear and terrifying. I was a child once more, standing in my old bedroom. Each time the closet door would swing open, propelled by an invisible, unholy wind. Over and over, as I approached, a malevolent darkness would spill forth like ink. And as my youthful fingers touched the door handle, a grotesque hand, decaying and drenched in icy malice, would seize my wrist. The hand's grip was deathly cold and suffocatingly tight, pulling me towards a dark void that threatened to consume my very soul. I awoke in a frenzied scream, catching the irritated glances of fellow passengers and flight attendants. Upon reaching home, the night had drawn its curtain, and the house was eerily silent. Jake, my son, had long been tucked into bed, and my wife lay sleeping. I poured myself a stiff drink, seeking solace in its burn. Collapsing onto the couch, I flicked on the TV, yearning for any distraction from the hellish visions that still haunted my thoughts. Those nightmares felt too real, too tangible. The sensation of that vile hand's grasp lingered, its icy touch still felt upon my wrist. Each time I closed my eyes, the horror replayed, a relentless reminder of an unspeakable evil I had unwittingly encountered. In the dim lighting of the living room, I noticed something amiss with my forearm. An indistinct handprint, reminiscent of a fading bruise, marred the skin. I was certain it hadn't been there earlier that day. Disconcerted and anxious, I murmured to myself, "What on earth is happening to me?" The house's stillness only amplified my rising panic, and I found myself pacing, the cold floor biting at my feet with every step. The craving for a cold beer nagged at my senses. Without giving a second thought to the late hour, I ventured to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle. The cap gave way with a satisfying hiss, and I quickly emptied its contents, each gulp seeking to quench an inexplicable thirst. A parched feeling lingered, as though I'd been wandering a desert for days, and even the thought of simple water repulsed me. Bottle after bottle, I downed them, the effervescence providing a brief distraction from the chaos enveloping me. By the time I had finished the entire six-pack, an uncontrollable belch, loud enough to startle anyone from their slumber, echoed in the room. My insatiable thirst then led me to an ancient, long-forgotten bottle of Gibson's stored away in a kitchen cabinet. The liquid flowed easily, the fiery burn I usually associated with the spirit now conspicuously absent. It settled warmly in my stomach, but with its comfort came an overpowering fatigue. Casting a weary glance at the clock, I noticed the hour was closing in on 3 in the morning. Concerned for my son, I tiptoed into Jake's room for a quick peek. The gentle rhythm of his breathing and the securely closed closet door provided some fleeting solace. By dawn, however, the world I knew had turned upside down. Jake had vanished. The bolts on the doors and windows were still in place, and he lacked both a key and a phone to trace his whereabouts. The weight of his absence crushed my spirit, and a sinking feeling hinted that locating him wouldn't be as straightforward as I wished. When the police arrived, they expressed surprise upon learning of my profession, eyebrows raising even further when they got wind of my recent case. "You think someone's imitating the modus operandi of the previous case?" one inquisitive detective pondered aloud. "I wish it were that uncomplicated." His partner added, "Or perhaps it's the original perpetrator." Despite my internal turbulence, I couldn't dismiss the plausibility of their hypotheses. The detectives, professional in their approach, requested to inspect Jake's room. Leading them down the dimly lit hallway, I explained, "I haven't altered anything since I noticed his absence. Everything is exactly as it was." As we neared the room's threshold, Jake's closet door began to behave erratically, first opening by a mere inch, then halting, before creaking open a little more. The taller detective, curiosity evident in his eyes, turned to me. "Has the closet always behaved in such a manner?" I hesitated for a beat, then responded, "Never. Why don't you take a closer inspection?"